At dawn, the jungle was silent. No warning shots, no dramatic speeches, just thousands of American boots hitting a forgotten beach in the Solomon Islands. Within 6 months, this nameless island would consume 2 armies, dozens of warships, hundreds of aircraft, and something Japan could never replace again: momentum. This was Guadalcanal. By mid-1942, the Pacific War looked decided. Japan had done what no Asian power had ever done before. In 6 months, it smashed through Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. Hong Kong fell. Singapore collapsed. The Philippines were bleeding out. Pearl Harbor still smoked in American memory. Tokyo's strategy was brutal but logical. Expand fast. Build an outer defensive ring. Bleed the United States so badly that Washington would accept a negotiated peace. And for a while, it worked. But wars rarely end on schedule. In May 1942, Japan's advance stumbled at Coral Sea. A month later, it shattered at Midway, where 4 Japanese fleet carriers burned and sank. The Imperial Japanese Navy survived, but its aura of invincibility did not. Still, Japan held the initiative, or so it believed. Then came Guadalcanal. Guadalcanal was not famous. It was not rich. It had no grand cities or harbors. It was a jungle-covered island in the southern Solomons, hot, wet, diseased, and strategically inconvenient, which is exactly why it mattered. In mid-1942, Japanese engineers began building an airfield on Guadalcanal. From there, Japanese aircraft could threaten the sea lanes between the United States and Australia. If completed, it would strangle Allied logistics in the South Pacific. For the first time in the war, the United States chose not to retreat. The decision was risky, rushed, and deeply imperfect. It was also the opening move of the Pacific counteroffensive. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines landed on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and nearby islands. The operation was codenamed Watchtower. It was the first major American amphibious assault of World War II. The Marines expected resistance. They did not expect silence. Japanese ground forces on Guadalcanal were few, scattered, and unprepared for an invasion of this scale. Within hours, the Marines captured the half-finished airfield. They renamed it Henderson Field, after a Marine aviator killed at Midway. What the Americans did not yet understand was this: they had just stepped into a battle that would not be decided by one landing, one fleet action, or one heroic charge. Guadalcanal would become a 6-month war of attrition, fought simultaneously. In the jungle, in the air, and at sea, often on the same night. The United States fought with industrial depth. Japan fought with elite skill and offensive spirit. On paper, Japan still held advantages: better night fighting naval tactics, highly trained pilots, experienced infantry hardened by years of expansion. But Guadalcanal exposed a fatal imbalance. Japan could fight brilliantly. It could not fight long. Every plane lost, every trained pilot killed, every veteran infantryman dead in the jungle was a wound Japan could not heal. The United States, bruised and inexperienced, could. Guadalcanal was not just an enemy. It was an environment designed to kill. Malaria, dysentery, heat exhaustion, fungal infections, and constant rain ravaged both sides. Supplies rotted. Weapons rusted. Wounded men lay in mud for days. Japanese soldiers began to starve. American Marines fought with inadequate food, ammunition, and artillery support, especially in the early months. At times, they survived only because Japanese logistics were even worse. This was not a campaign of sweeping maneuvers. It was a grinding contest of endurance. Japan counterattacked immediately. Troops were rushed in by destroyers running night missions the Americans called the Tokyo Express. Naval battles exploded in the waters around the island. Carrier strikes, cruiser duels, night torpedo attacks. Victory shifted back and forth, but slowly, almost invisibly, the strategic balance changed. Japan was winning battles. The United States was winning time, and time in a war of industry and training was everything. Guadalcanal did not break Japan in a single blow. It broke Japan piece by piece. In the next part, the story turns darker. Night naval battles fought at point-blank range. Japanese infantry assaults that bordered on suicide. And the moment Tokyo realized this island could not be retaken, momentum does not disappear overnight. It bleeds out. Guadalcanal belonged to the Americans by day. At night, it belonged to Japan. This was not an accident. It was doctrine. Before the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy trained obsessively for night combat. Its crews practiced optical range-finding, coordinated torpedo attacks, and high-speed maneuvers in darkness. Japanese destroyers carried the Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, the most lethal naval torpedo in the world. It outranged anything the Americans had and carried a massive warhead. The U.S. Navy, by contrast, had radar but little experience using it under fire. Guadalcanal became the testing ground where theory met blood. Japanese high command faced a brutal reality. Henderson Field now existed. By day, American aircraft from Henderson dominated the skies. Any slow transport ship approaching Guadalcanal in daylight would be bombed into wreckage. So Japan improvised. Fast destroyers would race down the slot at night, unload troops, food, and ammunition, then vanish before dawn. The Americans called it the Tokyo Express. It worked tactically. It failed strategically. Destroyers were not cargo ships. They could not carry artillery, vehicles, or enough food. Japanese soldiers arrived with rifles and courage, but little else. Heavy equipment stayed behind. Wounded men could not be evacuated. Japan was feeding a campaign with teaspoons. On the night of August 8th, 1942, Japanese cruisers slipped past Allied screens near Savo Island. What followed was a disaster for the Allies. In less than an hour, 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sunk. The Americans and Australians were stunned by the speed and precision of the attack. Japanese shells tore through sleeping crews. Flares illuminated ships seconds before impact. Confusion reigned. The Japanese commander withdrew before dawn, believing enemy carriers still nearby. He had just won one of the most lopsided naval victories of the war, and yet Henderson Field remained untouched. This would become the pattern. Again and again, Japanese forces inflicted sharp, painful blows. At sea, their night attacks sank cruisers and destroyers. On land, Japanese infantry launched fierce assaults through jungle and darkness, often achieving local breakthroughs. But every attack cost trained men. Every sunk destroyer weakened Japan's already stretched navy. Every night run burned fuel Japan could not replace. The Americans lost ships. They lost men. They lost confidence. But they did not lose the island. Everything on Guadalcanal revolved around Henderson Field. If the Japanese captured it, the campaign could still be reversed. If they failed, the war would grind them down. Japanese infantry assaults against the airfield were relentless. They attacked through swamps, across rivers, and over open ground under machine gun fire. Officers led from the front. Units advanced until they ceased to exist. The Americans called some of these attacks banzai charges. That word hides the reality. These were not fanatical rituals. They were desperate attempts to break a defensive line before starvation did it for them. They failed. Above the island, air combat became a daily ritual. Japanese pilots were skilled, aggressive, and fearless. Many had years of combat experience. American pilots were often fresh from training, still learning how not to die. But Henderson Field allowed the Americans to rotate aircraft and pilots in and out. Losses could be replaced. Japanese pilots could not. By late 1942, experienced Japanese aircrew were dying faster than they could be trained. The decline was subtle at first. Then it accelerated. Skill cannot be mass-produced overnight. Momentum cracked again. Japan did not realize immediately what was happening. On maps, Guadalcanal looked small. On reports, losses looked manageable. Individual battles seemed winnable. But wars are not won on individual nights. They are won by who still has trained men 6 months later. Guadalcanal was draining Japan's most precious resource, veteran personnel. By October, Japanese soldiers on the island were starving. Diaries recovered later spoke of eating grass, insects, and tree bark. Medical supplies vanished. Morale collapsed quietly, not dramatically. The Americans were suffering too. But their supply lines, though fragile, existed. Japan's were breaking. Guadalcanal did not defeat Japan with brilliance. It defeated Japan with persistence. In the next part, the campaign reaches its most violent phase. Massive naval battles fought at knife range. The last serious Japanese attempts to retake the airfield, and the moment when Tokyo's planners finally faced an unthinkable conclusion. Momentum does not shatter loudly. It erodes until one day it is simply gone. By late October 1942, Japanese commanders faced an uncomfortable truth. Every previous counterattack had failed. Every night run cost ships. Every infantry assault bled irreplaceable veterans. Yet Guadalcanal was still in American hands. If Japan wanted the island back, it would need to gamble big. Not another piecemeal reinforcement. Not another limited strike. This time, Japan would commit everything it could still move. November would decide the campaign. The Japanese plan was brutally simple. Bombard Henderson Field into rubble with battleships. Land a large reinforcement force with heavy weapons. Overwhelm exhausted American defenses. Reclaim the airfield and reverse the strategic balance. If it worked, Guadalcanal might still be saved. If it failed, the campaign would become untenable. The Imperial Japanese Navy prepared for its largest surface operation of the entire Guadalcanal campaign. The Americans were not blind to it. They were just desperately under-resourced. On the night of November 12, 1942, Japanese battleships approached Guadalcanal. Waiting for them were American forces that had no business winning a fair fight. Outnumbered, outgunned, poorly coordinated, and exhausted. What followed was not a textbook naval engagement. It was chaos. Ships fired at point-blank range. Searchlights cut through darkness. Commanders died on bridges. Vessels rammed each other in confusion. Radar contacts were misread. Orders came too late or not at all. This was naval warfare reduced to instinct and survival. The night battle was savage. American cruisers and destroyers charged Japanese battleships, knowing they would not survive sustained gunfire. They attacked anyway, buying time with their hulls. Japanese shells smashed through American ships, tearing them apart. But the Japanese formation broke down. Confusion spread. Command and control collapsed. By dawn, the sea was littered with wreckage. Both sides had taken terrible losses. But the crucial outcome was this. Henderson Field was still operational. The Japanese bombardment had failed. As morning came, the battlefield shifted. American aircraft from Henderson Field attacked Japanese ships retreating northward, damaging several vessels and preventing others from escaping the area. Japan had committed battleships in an effort to neutralize a single airfield. The attempt failed. Henderson Field remained operational, and the losses were severe. A second major effort followed on November 14, 15. Additional warships were committed, and risks increased accordingly. American naval forces again engaged superior opponents under difficult conditions. Losses were heavy on both sides, but the engagements delayed Japanese operations long enough to have decisive effects. By daylight, many Japanese transport ships were damaged, grounded, or destroyed along the coast. Reinforcements failed to reach frontline units in effective condition, and heavy equipment was lost before it could be unloaded. The final offensive collapsed before it could be fully executed. The November naval battles were not clear victories for the United States. Both sides suffered serious losses. However, only one side could sustain them. Japan lost capital ships, experienced crews, trained airmen, and the practical ability to mount another major counteroffensive. The United States also suffered losses, but gained strategic confidence that Japan could no longer dictate events around Guadalcanal. After November 1942, Japanese planning shifted from decisive attack toward endurance and delay. Guadalcanal was no longer treated as a position to be retaken, but as a liability to be contained. Fighting continued, but the strategic outcome was no longer in doubt. The next phase would focus on Japan's withdrawal and the lasting psychological impact of its first major offensive failure in the Pacific. Wars often end dramatically in films. In reality, they more often conclude with decisions made quietly. By December 1942, the situation on Guadalcanal was clear. Japan could no longer achieve victory. Japanese troops on the island were suffering from starvation, disease, and shortages of ammunition and equipment. Units that had landed at full strength were reduced to a fraction of their original numbers. Naval losses compounded the crisis. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost destroyers, cruisers, and experienced crews that could not be replaced. Battleships were committed at great risk without decisive results, and air units were no longer comparable to their strength in 1941. Henderson Field remained operational. Japanese planners faced an unavoidable choice: continue a costly and unwinnable campaign or withdraw and accept failure. In late December, Tokyo approved an evacuation plan known as Operation KE. The withdrawal was concealed through deception. Radio traffic increased, naval movements suggested reinforcements, and air attacks intensified, leading Allied forces to prepare for another offensive. Instead, Japanese destroyers evacuated troops at night in small, coordinated movements. The same transport system that had delivered reinforcements earlier was now used to remove survivors. Not all personnel could be evacuated. Some units were isolated inland, others incapacitated by illness. Rear elements covered the withdrawal, aware they would not be evacuated. On February 7, 1943, the final Japanese forces departed Guadalcanal. 6 months after the initial American landings, the campaign ended not with surrender, but with the disappearance of organized resistance. American patrols advanced cautiously, expecting renewed contact that never came. They found abandoned camps, rusted weapons, unburied graves. The island that had consumed so much life simply stopped fighting. Guadalcanal was not the largest battle of the Pacific War. It was not the bloodiest. But it was the first time Japan lost a major campaign outright, failed to achieve its objectives despite repeated efforts, and had to retreat under pressure. More importantly, it exposed limits Japan could not overcome. Japan could no longer replace trained pilots fast enough, sustain long-distance logistics under air attack, or trade ships and men on equal terms. The United States could. From this point forward, the strategic initiative shifted permanently. Japan would fight on, but it would never again choose the battlefield. Before Guadalcanal, Japan attacked. After Guadalcanal, Japan reacted. Every later battle in the Pacific carried the imprint of this campaign: defensive perimeters, desperate counterattacks, and shrinking options. Guadalcanal did not destroy Japan's military. It destroyed its freedom of action. And in war, that is often the real defeat. The soldiers left Guadalcanal behind. The consequences did not stay there. In the final part, we will step back and answer the question that matters most. Why Guadalcanal, more than Midway, marked the true turning point. How attrition rewrote Japan's war strategy, and why this battle still matters when people talk about momentum in modern war. Wars are often remembered for explosions. This one is remembered for what quietly stopped moving forward. People love Midway. It is clean. It is dramatic. 4 carriers burn, the balance shifts, cue the music. But Midway was a shock. Guadalcanal was a diagnosis. Midway told Japan it could lose ships. Guadalcanal proved Japan could lose wars of endurance, and that difference mattered far more. Japan entered the Pacific War built around quality. Elite pilots trained for years, highly drilled naval crews, infantry conditioned for offensive spirit and sacrifice. That system worked brilliantly in short wars. Guadalcanal forced a long one. During the campaign, Japan lost hundreds of experienced pilots, veteran naval crews trained before 1941, seasoned infantry units that formed the backbone of its army. Factories can build ships. They cannot rebuild experience on demand. The United States could train faster, rotate units, and absorb losses. Japan could not. Before Guadalcanal, Japan chose where to fight. After Guadalcanal, Japan responded to where it was attacked. This shift is subtle but fatal. From 1943 onward, Japanese strategy became defensive by necessity. Layered island defenses, attritional delaying actions, hopes of inflicting enough casualties to force negotiation. None of this regained momentum. It only slowed the inevitable. Guadalcanal marked the moment Japan stopped expanding and started managing decline. The American performance at Guadalcanal was messy. Commands were confused. Ships were lost through poor coordination. Ground forces suffered from inexperience, but the system learned. Radar doctrine improved. Joint operations improved. Logistics planning improved. Mistakes were analyzed, not hidden. Guadalcanal became the template for how the United States would fight across the Pacific. Overwhelming supply. Constant pressure. No pause long enough for Japan to recover. Momentum, once seized, was never handed back. Japanese soldiers and sailors did not stop fighting after Guadalcanal, but the belief that victory was inevitable disappeared. Captured documents and post-war testimony show a clear change. Expectations shortened. Objectives shrank. Language shifted from conquest to survival. War continued. Confidence did not. Guadalcanal haunted Japanese planning rooms for the rest of the conflict. Modern militaries study Guadalcanal not for tactics alone, but for what it teaches about momentum. Momentum is not speed. It is not morale. It is not victory in a single battle. Momentum is the ability to keep choosing. Guadalcanal took that ability away from Japan. Once lost, it never returned. No surrender ceremony ended the campaign. No treaty acknowledged defeat. The island simply emptied. And with it, the idea that Japan could still dictate the war. The Pacific War would continue for 2.5 more years. But from February 1943 onward, it moved in only one direction. Guadalcanal was not the battle that destroyed Japan. It was the battle that ensured Japan would eventually be destroyed by time. Momentum does not die loudly. It starves. It erodes. It retreats at night. And once it is gone, even the bravest army can only delay the end.